The hiss of the steam engine is a serpent's sigh, bleeding pressure into the thin, dry air of Redemption Creek. Jacob Vance shifts his weight from one worn boot to the other, the sparse collection of prairie wildflowers in his hand already beginning to wilt under the unforgiving Montana sun. He feels the curious eyes of the handful of station loiterers on his back. A man waiting for a mail-order bride is a spectacle, a quiet admission of a life gone wanting. He scans the faces descending from the passenger car, his heart a nervous drum against his ribs. He's looking for Sarah Miller. Plain, sturdy, with honest eyes that promised resilience in her letter. A woman who understood that life on the frontier was about work, not poetry. The photograph he clutched in his pocket showed a woman whose face was a map of practicality, and that was all he had asked for. A partner, a helpmate to push back the crushing silence of his isolated ranch. One by one, the passengers step onto the splintered platform, their faces grim with the dust of travel. None match the photograph. A grim-faced family with 3 screaming children. A pair of slick-haired salesmen. An old woman leaning heavily on a cane. And then her. She is the last to disembark, a small, slender figure swallowed by a simple, dark dress of a cut he's never seen before. Her hair is the color of polished jet, pulled back in a severe, intricate knot. Her face is pale, her features delicate, and her eyes, dark and intelligent, sweep across the platform with a guarded alertness that misses nothing. She is Chinese, and in her hands, she holds a small, crudely painted wooden placard. On it, in stark black letters, are 2 words, J. Vance. A ripple of shock, then derision, moves through the onlookers. A low chuckle comes from the station master, a portly man named Henderson who thrives on the town's small dramas. Jacob feels the blood drain from his face. The wildflowers in his hand suddenly feel foolish, their bright colors a mockery. This is not Sarah Miller. This is not plain. This is not simple. This is a problem, a glaring, public complication he cannot begin to fathom. The woman takes a hesitant step forward, her gaze finally locking with his. In her eyes, he sees not deception, but a deep, weary trepidation that mirrors his own shock. Henderson saunters over, a greasy smirk on his face. "Looks like you got yourself a different kind of mail order, Vance," he says, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Bit more exotic than advertised. Jacob's world narrows to 2 points. Henderson's mocking sneer and the quiet, profound dignity in the strange woman's eyes. She is alone, 1,000 miles from anywhere she might call home, and the world is looking at her like she's a stray cur. A choice, heavy and immediate as a blacksmith's hammer, settles in his gut. He could turn away. He could declare it a mistake and leave her to the mercy of the railroad, the town, the vast, uncaring wilderness. Or he could honor the name on that sign. Well, that's one way to meet. Before these two figure each other out, tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've met someone important? Share your story in the comments. And if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button. He took a slow breath, the dust and coal smoke filling his lungs. The smirks and whispers of the town faded into a dull hum. He looked at the woman, truly looked at her. She was small, yes, but she stood straight, her shoulders unbowed despite the hostile stares. There was a strength in her stillness that the photograph of Sarah Miller, with her plain, stolid features, had never hinted at. The name on the sign was his. A contract was a contract, even if the goods delivered were not what he'd ordered. He'd paid the agency. He'd made a promise. Ignoring Henderson, Jacob took a step forward, closing the space between them. He stopped a respectful distance away, his gaze fixed on her. The wildflowers felt absurd, so he let his hand drop to his side. He gave a short, stiff nod, a gesture that was both an acknowledgement and a claim. "I'm Jacob Vance," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. The woman's expression did not change, but a flicker of something, relief, perhaps, passed through her dark eyes. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of deference that felt ancient and out of place on the dusty platform of Redemption Creek. She spoke a single word, her voice soft, melodic, and utterly incomprehensible to him. The journey to his ranch was a study in suffocating silence. Jacob drove the wagon, his shoulders tight with a tension that went bone deep. He was acutely aware of the woman sitting beside him, her hands folded primly in her lap, her body held rigid as if to take up as little space as possible. He had tried to ask her name, but she had only looked at him with a polite, blank confusion. The language barrier was not a fence. It was a fortress wall, thick and insurmountable. He risked a sideways glance. She was staring out at the rolling landscape, a vast, sun-bleached expanse of grass and rock under an endless blue sky. What did she see? Did she see the promise of land, of a new life? Or did she see an empty, terrifying void, a prison of open space? He thought of his own life, the quiet desperation that had led him to send for a bride in the first place. The ranch, left to him by his father, was more burden than blessing. The soil was stubborn, the creek ran low in the summer, and the winters were a brutal siege. He'd lost his wife, Martha, and their infant son to a fever 5 years ago, and the silence they'd left behind had grown into a living thing, a constant, crushing presence in the small cabin. He hadn't sought love or passion from Sarah Miller. He had sought a companion in labor, another soul to share the silence, to make it less absolute. Now, sitting next to this stranger, the silence was louder than ever. It was filled with unspoken questions, with the chasm of culture and language that separated them. When they finally crested the last rise and his homestead came into view, he felt a pang of something close to shame. The cabin was small, built of sturdy but unadorned pine, weathered to a silver gray. The barn sagged slightly to one side, a testament to a winter storm he'd never found the time or spirit to fully repair. A few chickens scratched in the dirt near a struggling vegetable patch. It was a life scraped from the dirt, and it looked every bit as weary as he felt. He pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down, the familiar creak of his bones a grim welcome. He turned to help her, but she was already moving, sliding off the seat with a fluid grace that surprised him. She stood for a moment, her gaze taking in the humble spread. He braced himself for a reaction, disappointment, fear, perhaps even tears. Instead, she simply looked at it, her expression unreadable, and then turned her gaze to him. "This is it," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "Home." She, of course, did not understand. She gave that same slight, formal bow. He gestured toward the cabin, and she followed him, her steps light on the hard-packed earth. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, flanked by a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs. A small kitchen area was tucked into a corner, and a single door led to the only other room, the bedroom. He had spent the entire week before her arrival cleaning, scrubbing the floors, mending the curtains Martha had sewn, trying to erase the starkness of a man living alone. He pointed to the bedroom door. "You," he said, tapping his chest for emphasis, then pointing at her. "There." Then he pointed to the worn armchair and horse blanket by the hearth. "Me. Here." A flicker of understanding crossed her face. Her eyes widened slightly, and she shook her head, a flurry of soft, unintelligible words spilling from her lips as she gestured for him to take the room. He was firm, shaking his own head and pointing again, his expression leaving no room for argument. A man did not turn a woman out of her bed, stranger or not. It was a simple code, perhaps the only one he had left to cling to. Reluctantly, she acquiesced, giving another small bow before disappearing into the room and closing the door softly behind her. Jacob sank into the armchair, the springs groaning in protest. He ran a hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble a familiar, grating sound. What had he done? He had a woman in his home he couldn't speak to, a woman from a world so different from his own it might as well have been the moon. The agency would have to answer for this. He would write a letter, demand an explanation, demand they take her back and send him the woman he'd paid for. But as he sat there in the growing twilight, the image of her standing on that platform, alone and defiant amidst the sneers, returned to him. Sending her back? Where? To what? He had a sickening feeling that he was the only thing standing between her and a fate far worse than a life on a failing Montana ranch. The weight of his impulsive decisions settled over him, as vast and empty as the darkening plains outside his window. The next few days passed in a haze of awkward pantomime. They developed a rudimentary system of communication built on gestures and pointing. He showed her the well, the chicken coop, the woodpile. She watched him with an intense, focused concentration, her memory seemingly flawless. By the second day, she was collecting the eggs and tending the fire before he was even fully awake. She moved about the cabin with a quiet efficiency that was both impressive and unnerving. She was a ghost in his home, a silent presence that straightened, cleaned, and organized with a meticulousness that put his own bachelor habits to shame. She had a small, cloth-wrapped bundle in her satchel. From it, she produced sticks of what looked like black ink and delicate brushes. In the evenings, while he sat cleaning a rifle or mending a harness, she would sit at the table, grinding the ink on a small stone and painting complex, beautiful characters on scraps of paper he'd given her. He watched her, fascinated. The brush moved in her slender fingers with a dancer's grace, leaving behind a trail of elegant, incomprehensible symbols. Sarah Miller's letters had been written in a barely legible scrawl. This woman was an artist. One evening, he found the courage to approach the table. He pointed to one of the characters she had just painted. "What?" he asked, pointing to his own chest. "Jacob." She looked from the character to his face, and a slow dawn of understanding spread across her features. She pointed to the symbol. "Jia," she said, her voice soft. Then she painted another character, a more intricate one, and pointed to herself. "Mei Lin. Mei Lin," he repeated, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. It was the first real piece of her he had, a name to attach to the silent woman in his house. A small smile, the first he had seen, touched her lips. It was a fleeting thing, but it transformed her face, softening the guarded lines around her eyes and revealing a glimpse of the woman beneath the layers of fear and caution. It was in her small satchel that he found the answer. He hadn't meant to pry. She had left it on the table while she was outside, and a corner of a letter, written in familiar English script, had poked out. His conscience warred with his desperate need for understanding, and the need won. His hands, clumsy and thick, carefully extracted the folded pages. The letter was addressed to him, Mr. J. Vance, and it was not from Sarah Miller. It was from a Sister Agnes of a mission in San Francisco. His blood ran cold as he read. "Dear Mr. Vance," the letter began. "It is with a heavy heart that I must inform you of the passing of Miss Sarah Miller. She took ill with a lung fever during the final leg of her journey, and, despite our best efforts, passed into the arms of the Lord 2 nights ago." Jacob sank into his chair, the words blurring before his eyes. Sarah Miller was dead. The letter continued, explaining the situation with a stark, compassionate clarity. "The young woman who brings you this letter is named Mei Lin. She was Miss Miller's companion, hired to assist her on the arduous trip. She is an orphan, her family having perished in the railroad camps, and she is a soul of remarkable character and fortitude. She nursed Miss Miller with a devotion that was truly Christian in its selflessness. It was Miss Miller's dying wish that Mei Lin take her place. She feared for the girl's fate, alone and unprotected in this land. She made me promise to send Mei Lin on to you, with her ticket and her placard, believing you to be a man of good character who would offer this child a chance at a life free from the servitude and cruelty she has known. I know this is a deception, sir," Sister Agnes had written, "and a great shock. But I ask you to look upon this young woman not as an impostor, but as the recipient of a dying woman's last hope. Her circumstances are most desperate. She has nowhere else to turn. I pray you will find it in your heart to show her mercy." He read the letter twice, the paper trembling in his hand. Deception. Mercy. The words echoed in the silent cabin. He looked out the window and saw her, Mei Lin, kneeling in the dirt of his neglected vegetable garden, patiently pulling weeds. She was not a trickster. She was a survivor, a piece of human driftwood washed up on his shore by a tragic tide. The anger he had felt at the station, the frustration of the last few days, all of it evaporated, replaced by a profound, aching pity. He thought of the sneers in town, the way Henderson had looked at her. He thought of her alone, with no money, no English, no one. Sister Agnes was right. He was all she had. The letter didn't solve his problem. It deepened it, transforming it from a mere inconvenience into a moral crisis. What did a man of good character do? That evening, the silence at the dinner table was different. It was no longer just awkward. It was heavy with his new knowledge. He watched her eat, her movements precise and graceful even with the crude wooden chopsticks she had carved for herself. He saw the weariness in the slump of her shoulders, the faint, bruised shadows under her eyes. He saw not an exotic stranger, but a terrified young woman trying desperately to hold herself together. After the meal, he took the letter and placed it on the table between them. He pointed to the name, Sarah Miller, and then made a gesture of sleeping, his head tilted on his hands, his eyes closed. He then pointed to the name, Mei Lin, and then to her. He didn't know how to explain the rest, the fever, the dying wish, the plea for mercy. But she seemed to understand the most important part. Her eyes fixed on the letter, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. She didn't sob or make a sound. She simply sat there as the tear fell, a quiet, dignified grief that tore at something deep inside him. He had the sudden, overwhelming urge to reach across the table and comfort her, but he didn't know how. The wall between them was still there, and he had no words, in any language, to breach it. The next morning, the first test of his resolve arrived in the form of a buckboard wagon, carrying Mrs. Gable, the town's self-appointed moral compass, and her two cronies, Mrs. Prentice and Mrs. Davies. They descended upon his ranch like a flock of crows, their faces pinched with sanctimonious curiosity. "Jacob Vance," Mrs. Gable declared, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We've come to welcome your new bride." The pause before the word bride was laden with insinuation. Jacob met them on the porch, positioning himself squarely in the doorway. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Gable, but we're not receiving visitors." "Nonsense," she sniffed, peering past him into the cabin, her eyes searching for Mei Lin. "The whole town is talking. It's a scandal, Jacob, bringing a heathen Chinese woman into a good Christian community. What were you thinking?" At that moment, Mei Lin appeared in the doorway behind him, drawn by the sound of their sharp voices. She clutched a dishcloth in her hands, her eyes wide with alarm. The three women stared at her, their expressions a mixture of disgust and fascination, as if she were a creature in a traveling circus. "She doesn't even speak English, I hear," Mrs. Prentice whispered loudly. "Look at her clothes." "Shameless," Mrs. Davies added. Jacob felt a hot surge of anger, fierce and protective. It surprised him. These were the women he had known his whole life, pillars of the church, leaders of the town's social circle. And they were cruel. "Her name," Jacob said, his voice low and dangerous, "is Mei Lin, and she is under my protection. This is my home. You are not welcome here." Mrs. Gable gasped, her hand flying to her chest in theatrical shock. "Well, I never. After all we've done for you, Jacob, checking on you after poor Martha passed. And this is the thanks we get? You've chosen this creature over your own kind." "I've chosen decency," he shot back. "Something you seem to have left back in town. Now, I'll thank you to get off my land." He stood his ground, an unmovable wall of quiet fury, until they finally retreated, muttering amongst themselves about damnation and impropriety. They climbed back into their buckboard and departed in a cloud of dust and indignation. When they were gone, Jacob turned. Mei Lin was still standing in the doorway, her knuckles white where she gripped the dishcloth. She was looking at him, and for the first time, the guarded mask was gone. In its place was a look of raw, stunned gratitude. She didn't have to understand the words that had been exchanged. She had understood the tone, the animosity, the threat, and she had understood that he had stood between her and it. She took a hesitant step forward and did something that shocked him more than the women's visit. She reached out and gently touched his arm, her small hand resting on his forearm for just a second. Then she bowed her head deeply and retreated back into the cabin. The touch was feather-light, but it burned on his skin for the rest of the day, a silent acknowledgement, a fragile bridge thrown across the chasm of silence between them. He had made his choice. He had defended her. And in doing so, he realized with a jolt, he had bound himself to her in a way he had never intended. The confrontation with Mrs. Gable and her companions marked a subtle but profound shift in the dynamic of the cabin. The shared experience of weathering that small, vicious storm had forged a new kind of alliance between them. The awkwardness began to recede, replaced by a quiet, functional partnership. Jacob found himself looking for ways to breach the wall of silence, not out of mere necessity, but out of a growing curiosity about the woman who now shared his life. He began a nightly ritual. After their meal, he would take out a child's primer he had bought for his son, a book he hadn't been able to look at in 5 years. He would point to the simple drawings and say the words aloud. Apple, house, dog, horse. Mei Lin was an astonishingly quick study. She would listen, her head tilted, her brow furrowed in concentration, and then repeat the word, her accent thick, but her pronunciation careful. She would then take her brush and paint the corresponding Chinese character next to the English word in a small notebook he'd given her. Within a week, she had a vocabulary of dozens of words. Soon, they could exchange simple, fragmented sentences. Sky blue, she would say, pointing out the window. Yes, he would nod. Sky is blue. You work hard, she said one evening, gesturing to his calloused hands. The simple observation, so earnest and direct, touched him. So do you, he replied, looking at her own hands, which were becoming chapped and rough from the lye soap and the garden soil. Through these halting conversations, fragments of her past began to emerge. He learned that Jia meant home or family. He learned her family had come from a province with mountains, seeking gold on the Gamsan, the gold mountain of America. Instead, they had found brutal labor building the railroad through the Sierras. She spoke the words father and mother, and then drew her finger across her throat, a gesture of finality that needed no translation. The railroad had taken them both. In turn, she learned about him. He showed her the small, faded photograph of Martha and their son, Jacob Jr., that he kept on the mantelpiece. He pointed to them, then to the small, overgrown patch of land behind the cabin where 2 simple wooden crosses stood. Wife, he said, his voice thick. Son. She looked at the picture for a long time, her dark eyes filled with a deep, knowing sadness. She placed her hand gently over her heart and bowed her head. In that moment of shared grief, he felt a connection to her that was deeper than any words. She understood loss. She understood the silence that followed it. Life on the ranch fell into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the land. Jacob worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, tending to his small herd of cattle, and trying to coax a meager crop of hay from the stubborn soil. Mei Lin, meanwhile, transformed the space around the cabin. Her garden, which he had initially dismissed, began to flourish under her patient care. She grew not only the familiar beans and squash, but also strange, leafy greens and pungent herbs he'd never seen before. She would spend hours tending it, her small figure a constant presence against the vast landscape. She had a way with animals, a quiet, calming presence that soothed even the most skittish calf. She took over the care of the chickens, and soon they were producing more eggs than ever before. She even seemed to win over his grizzled, cantankerous old horse, Zeus, who would allow her to stroke his nose and feed him apples without his usual display of ill temper. Her cooking was a revelation. Using the herbs from her garden and the meager supplies they had, she created meals that were fragrant and flavorful, a world away from the bland stews and fried bacon that had been his staple. She taught him how to use chopsticks, laughing softly at his clumsy attempts, her laughter a rare and precious sound in the quiet cabin. He found himself watching her constantly. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she stitched a patch on his work shirt, her stitches impossibly small and neat. He watched the way she shielded her eyes against the sun as she looked out over the plains, a lonely, resilient figure. He began to see not just a stranger or a burden, but a woman of immense strength and quiet grace. He started to notice the small details, the way a stray wisp of hair would curl at her temple, the curve of her neck when she bent over her work, the intelligence that shone in her dark, expressive eyes. The town of Redemption Creek, however, remained a source of constant, low-grade hostility. Every trip for supplies was an ordeal. He would feel the weight of disapproving stares, hear the whispers that stopped abruptly when he turned his head. Children would sometimes point at Mei Lin, their voices carrying on the wind. Look, Pa, it's the Chinaman's woman. Jacob learned to ignore it, his face setting into a hard, unapproachable mask whenever they were in town. He would conduct his business quickly, his hand never far from Mei Lin's elbow, a silent, protective presence. He knew the talk was ugly. He was living in sin with a heathen. He had shamed the memory of his good Christian wife. He had brought a stain upon the community. Let them talk. The warmth and quiet companionship he was beginning to find back at the cabin were worth more than the good opinion of people like Mrs. Gable. One blistering afternoon in late summer, the simmering threat of the outside world boiled over and arrived at his doorstep. Jacob was repairing a harness in the barn when he heard the sound of an approaching horse. He stepped out into the blinding sunlight and saw a man he recognized with a knot of dread in his stomach. It was Silas Croft, the foreman from the nearest railroad spur, a man known for his cruel temper and his contempt for the Chinese laborers who worked under him. Croft was a big man, florid and beefy, with small, mean eyes. "Vance," Croft called out, dismounting without being invited. He let the reins of his horse drop to the ground. "Heard you picked up some stray company property." Jacob's hand tightened on the awl he was holding. He moved to block the path to the cabin, where he knew Mei Lin was. "This is private land, Croft. State your business and get out." Croft laughed, a short, ugly bark. "My business is with the chippy you got stashed in there. One of my boys saw you in town. Recognized her. She's a runaway. Skipped out on her indenture contract with the railroad." His eyes flickered past Jacob towards the cabin, a lecherous glint in them. "I'm here to collect her." The world seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and hot. Jacob remembered the fear in Mei Lin's eyes when she spoke of the railroad. He remembered her gesture of a throat being cut. This was the man she was running from. "She's not property," Jacob said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And she's not going anywhere with you." "Oh, I think she is," Croft sneered, taking a step forward. "The law is on my side, Vance. An indenture is a legal contract. She belongs to the company. Or, maybe we can make a different arrangement." He pulled a small, greasy pouch from his belt. "I'll give you $20 for her. Save us both a lot of trouble with the sheriff." The casual, dehumanizing offer, the idea of buying and selling her like a head of cattle, snapped something inside Jacob. A cold, clean rage, unlike anything he had ever felt, washed through him. He didn't say another word. He turned, walked back into the barn, and emerged a moment later with his 12-gauge shotgun. He leveled it at Croft's chest. "You have 10 seconds to get on your horse and ride off my land," Jacob said, his voice flat and empty of all emotion. "If you are still here when I count to 10, I will consider you a trespasser with intent to do harm. And I will shoot you." Croft's arrogant smirk faltered. He looked from Jacob's cold, steady eyes to the twin barrels of the shotgun. He was a bully, used to intimidating men weaker than himself. He wasn't used to this. "You're crazy, Vance," he blustered, but he started backing away toward his horse. 1. Jacob began to count, his voice echoing in the still air. 2. 3-inch. Croft scrambled onto his horse, yanking viciously on the reins. "This isn't over. I'll be back with the sheriff. You'll see." 10. Jacob said to the empty air as Croft galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and impotent threats behind him. He stood there for a long time, the heavy shotgun a comforting weight in his hands, his heart pounding against his ribs. The rage slowly subsided, leaving behind a chilling clarity. This was no longer just about offering shelter. This was a fight. He had just declared war on Silas Croft, and by extension, the prejudices of the entire region. He turned and saw Mei Lin standing on the porch, her face ashen. She had seen the whole thing. Her hands were pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and something else, something that looked like awe. He had stood for her. He had threatened a man's life for her. He walked over to the porch and leaned the shotgun against the wall. He looked at her, and the distance that had always existed between them, the last remnants of their strangeness to one another, seemed to dissolve in the harsh afternoon light. He was no longer just her protector by circumstance. He had become her defender by choice. And looking at her terrified, grateful face, he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he would do it again. He would burn the whole world down before he let a man like Croft lay a hand on her. The realization was terrifying. The simple, practical arrangement he had envisioned with Sarah Miller was a distant dream. His life was now inextricably tangled with this brave, silent woman, and he was beginning to suspect that his heart was, too. In the days that followed the confrontation with Silas Croft, a palpable tension settled over the ranch. Every distant rider, every coyote's howl in the night, sent a jolt of anxiety through them both. Croft's threat to return with the sheriff hung in the air like the smell of smoke before a fire. Jacob took to carrying a pistol on his hip during the day and kept the shotgun loaded by the door at night. The piece they had carefully constructed felt fragile, a thin pane of glass waiting to be shattered. The shared danger, however, had an unintended consequence. It drew them closer. Words became less necessary. A shared look across the dinner table could convey a warning, a reassurance, a question. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her expression, the slight tightening of her jaw when she was worried, the softening of her eyes when she tended to her garden. She, in turn, seemed to be able to sense his moods, leaving him in peace when he was brooding and offering a quiet cup of tea when he was weary. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, the wind rattling the window panes, she approached him while he was oiling his pistol at the table. She carried her notebook and her ink brush. She sat opposite him and, with deft strokes, painted a series of characters. Then she began to speak, her English still halting but imbued with a new urgency. She pointed to the first character. "Croft," she said, her voice filled with a venom he had never heard from her. Then she painted another. "Father." She gestured to the mountains in the distance, then made a collapsing motion with her hands, a sound of an explosion soft on her lips. Boom! She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. Her father had been killed in a tunnel collapse, a work accident that was all too common. Then came the most difficult part. She pointed back to the character for Croft. She touched her own shoulder, then her face, and flinched away, a look of profound disgust twisting her features. She shook her head violently. "No, no good." She made a gesture of running, her fingers flying across the table. "I run." Jacob's blood ran cold. The pieces clicked into place. It wasn't just an indenture contract she had fled. She was running from Croft himself. He had tried to force himself on her, likely after her father's death left her utterly alone and vulnerable. The man wasn't just a bully, he was a predator. Jacob's earlier rage returned, colder and harder this time. "Missionary," she continued, her voice softer. "Sister Agnes. Help." She pointed to the letter he had found, then to the placard with his name on it. "Sarah Miller's sick. She say you go. Vance, good man." It was all there. The whole story, laid bare in broken words and desperate gestures. She wasn't an imposter who had stolen a dead woman's chance. She was a refugee, and Sarah Miller and Sister Agnes had conspired to give her a lifeline. And he was the one at the other end of it. The weight of that responsibility, of those two women's faith in his character, settled on him. He reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his own. "I understand," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are safe here, Maylin. I promise." She looked down at his large, calloused hand covering hers. When she looked up again, her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears. She didn't pull away. She simply turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. They sat like that for a long time as the storm broke outside, the sound of the rain a comforting drumbeat against the roof of their small, fortified world. It was the first time they had touched with deliberate, mutual affection, and the connection was as powerful and undeniable as a lightning strike. The reprieve did not last. A week later, two riders crested the hill. One was Silas Croft, his face a mask of smug triumph. The other was Sheriff Brody, a weary, pot-bellied man who enforced the law with a distinct lack of enthusiasm but a firm belief in the established order. Jacob met them at the fence line, the shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. Maylin watched from the cabin doorway, her face pale. "Vance," Brody said, tipping his hat with a sigh. "Croft here has filed a formal complaint. Says you're harboring a fugitive from the Central Pacific Railroad. Got an indenture contract here with a thumbprint on it. Says this woman, name unknown, belongs to them until her family's travel debt is paid. Her name is May Lin," Jacob said, his voice level. "And that contract is worthless. It was signed under duress, and her father, who signed it, is dead. The debt died with him." "That ain't how the company sees it," Croft interjected, a nasty smile on his face. "The debt passes to the next of kin. She's company property, Sheriff. I'm here to take her back." "This is my property," Jacob stated, his knuckles white on the shotgun. "And she is on it, under my protection. You are not taking her." Sheriff Brody sighed again, rubbing the back of his neck. He was a man caught in the middle, and he clearly didn't relish the position. "Now, Jacob," let's not make this difficult. The law is the law. The contract seems legal. I can't just ignore it. I'll have the whole railroad company on my neck. I have to take her in. Jacob looked from Brody's tired, resigned face to Croft's eager, predatory one. He saw the trap closing. He could fight, but it would be futile. They would call him an outlaw, and they would come back with a posse. They would take her, and they would likely kill him. He was out of options. His mind raced, searching for a loophole, a different kind of law that could supersede a cruel and unjust contract. And then it came to him, a desperate, insane, and utterly brilliant idea. It was a law older than any railroad contract, a law recognized by God and man. You can't take her, Sheriff, Jacob said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. And why is that? Brody asked, his patience clearly wearing thin. Jacob took a deep breath. Because you cannot take a man's wife. Silence. Croft's jaw dropped. Sheriff Brody stared at him as if he had grown a second head. His what? Croft sputtered. She is my intended, Jacob announced, his gaze unwavering. We are to be married. As my wife, she is a citizen under my legal protection. Her debts become my debts, and her contracts are nullified under the laws of matrimony. Your indenture agreement isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Brody looked from Jacob's resolute face to Mei Lin, who was standing on the porch, watching the scene with wide, uncomprehending eyes. He seemed to be weighing the legal and social complexities. A runaway Chinese laborer was one thing. The wife of a local white landowner, however troubled, was another entirely. Is this true, Vance? The sheriff asked, his voice laced with skepticism. This ain't some trick to get out of this. We ride into town tomorrow to see the preacher, Jacob said, the lie rolling off his tongue with surprising ease. You and the whole town can bear witness. Croft was apoplectic. He's lying. Look at them. He can't marry her. The disgust in his voice was thick. That's his business, not yours, Croft, the sheriff said, a flicker of something, perhaps respect for Jacob's audacity, in his eyes. He was a man who understood the letter of the law. A marriage contract would indeed take precedence. All right, Vance. You've got until tomorrow. If you're not at that church, I'm coming back with a warrant and a posse. And I won't be in a negotiating mood. He tipped his hat again, turned his horse, and rode away, leaving Croft fuming in his wake. Croft glared at Jacob, his face purple with rage. You'll regret this, Vance, he spat, before wheeling his horse around and galloping after the sheriff. Jacob watched them go, his body trembling with the adrenaline of the bluff. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. He had just publicly declared his intention to marry a woman he had never spoken to about love, a woman who didn't even know what he had just promised on her behalf. He turned and walked slowly back to the cabin. Mei Lin was still standing on the porch, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. He stopped in front of her, the weight of his next words feeling heavier than any stone. Mei Lin, he began, his voice softer now. We need to talk. He led her inside, and they sat at the table, the charged air of the confrontation still clinging to them. He tried to explain, using the simple English words they shared, supplemented with gestures and drawings in the dust on the table. He drew a picture of Croft, then a picture of a cage. He pointed to her. Croft, take you. Her eyes widened in understanding and fear. Then, he drew a picture of a man and a woman holding hands in front of a church. He pointed to himself, then to her. We marry, he said, the word feeling monumental and terrifying. We marry you safe. Croft no touch. He tried to explain the legality of it, the way a wife was protected by her husband's name and status. He made it clear, as best he could, that this was a solution, a shield. He did not speak of love or affection. He spoke of safety and protection. It was a business proposition, a desperate gambit to save her life. She listened intently, her gaze never leaving his face. He saw the wheels turning in her mind as she processed the impossible choice he was laying before her. To remain a fugitive, to be hunted by Croft and eventually caught, or to bind herself legally and permanently to him, a man she barely knew, a stranger from a different world. When he was finished, he fell silent, giving her space to think. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece, each second stretching into an eternity. He had made a promise to the sheriff, but he would not force her. The choice had to be hers. If she said no, He would find another way. He would fight them. Consequences be damned. Finally, she looked up at him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear and steady. There was no fear in them now, only a quiet, solemn resolve. She reached out and placed her small hand on top of his on the table. "Mary," she said, her voice a soft but firm whisper. "Jacob and Mei Lin." It was not the proposal a woman dreamed of. It was not born of romance or courtship, but of desperation and danger. Yet, in her simple acceptance, in the steady pressure of her hand on his, he felt a commitment more profound than any flowery vow. They were two survivors, clinging to each other in a storm. And tomorrow, they would ride into the heart of that storm and face it together. The ride into Redemption Creek felt like a procession to the gallows. Jacob sat tall in the wagon seat, the shotgun resting across his lap, his jaw set in a grim line. Beside him, Mei Lin was a study in stillness. She wore her best dress, the same dark, simple garment she had arrived in, but she had brushed her jet-black hair until it shone and had pinned a single, hardy prairie wildflower into the intricate knot at the back of her head. It was a small, defiant gesture of beauty in the face of what was sure to be an ugly day. As they neared the town, they could feel the eyes on them. People stopped in the street to stare. Windows' curtains twitched. The news of Jacob Vance's insane declaration had spread like wildfire. They were not just a curiosity anymore. They were a spectacle, a challenge to the town's rigid, unwritten rules. As they turned onto Main Street, they saw them. Silas Croft was waiting on the porch of the saloon, flanked by 4 of his thuggish railroad workers. Their arms were crossed, their faces set in belligerent sneers. Further down, Sheriff Brody stood outside his office, watching them with a weary, neutral expression. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath. Jacob pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the small, white-steepled church at the end of the street. He got down, then turned to help Mei Lin. He took her hand, and her fingers were cold as ice, but her grip was firm. He squeezed it gently, a silent promise. "I am with you." They had taken no more than 2 steps toward the church when Croft and his men moved to block their path. "Going somewhere, Vance?" Croft sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near Jacob's boots. "We have business with the preacher," Jacob said, his voice calm and even. He kept himself positioned slightly in front of Mei Lin, shielding her. "I don't think so," Croft said, stepping closer, his sheer bulk menacing. "The sheriff might be a coward, but I'm not. You're not marrying this thing. I'm taking what's mine. Hand her over." From across the street, Mrs. Gable, who had appeared as if summoned by the scent of scandal, shrieked, "It's an outrage. A sacrilege. Marrying a heathen in a house of God." The street was filling with onlookers now, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and outright hostility. They were surrounded. Jacob felt Mei Lin tremble behind him. He knew this was the moment. There was no turning back. "She is not a thing," Jacob said, his voice ringing out in the sudden silence. It was not loud, but it carried an authority that made even Croft pause. "She is a woman, and she is to be my wife. Her name is Mei Lin Vance." He said the name deliberately, a claim, a fact he was willing into existence. Croft laughed. "Vance. She ain't fit to carry that name. She's a runaway, a piece of property. Tell him, Sheriff," he yelled. "Tell him what the law says." Sheriff Brody sighed and pushed himself off the wall of his office, walking slowly toward the growing crowd. "The law is complicated, Croft," he said, his eyes on Jacob. "But a man's right to marry is a powerful one. He's making a mockery of this town." Mrs. Gable cried out. It was then that Mei Lin did something Jacob never would have expected. She stepped out from behind him. She stood beside him, her small frame seeming impossibly fragile in the face of so much hatred, but her back was ramrod straight. She looked not at Croft, but at the faces in the crowd, at Mrs. Gable and the others who judged her without knowing her. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it was clear and steady, each English word carefully chosen. "I am not property," she said. The crowd quieted, surprised to hear her speak. "My father, he died for railroad." For Mr. Croft, she pointed a single, trembling finger at the foreman. "He is not good man. He hurt people. He tried to hurt me." A gasp went through the crowd. "This man," she said, turning her gaze to Jacob, her voice softening. "Jacob Vance is good man." He is kind. He saved me. She looked back at the townspeople, her eyes pleading. He give me Jia. She touched her heart. Home. Her simple, heartfelt testimony, delivered in her broken English, was more powerful than any legal argument Jacob could have made. It cut through the prejudice and the posturing and laid the truth bare for all to see. She was not a thing or a heathen. She was a human being who had suffered, and Jacob was the only one who had offered her kindness. Just then, the church doors opened. The Reverend Michael Thayer stood on the steps, his Bible in his hand. He was a kind, elderly man who had officiated Martha's funeral and had seen the depths of Jacob's loneliness in the years since. "That is enough, Mr. Croft," the Reverend said, his voice calm but firm. "The grievances of the railroad company have no place on the steps of my church. A marriage is a holy sacrament, a contract before God. It supersedes any worldly indenture." He looked at Jacob and Mei Lin, his eyes filled with a surprising warmth and understanding. "Jacob, Mei Lin, please come inside. The Lord's house is open to you." The Reverend's intervention was the final, decisive blow. It was an endorsement from the highest moral authority in town. Sheriff Brody, looking relieved to have his decision made for him, stepped forward. "You heard the Reverend, Croft. This is a church matter now. Your business here is concluded. Disperse, all of you." Croft stood there, his face a thundercloud of fury and disbelief. He had been outmaneuvered, his power and authority publicly dismantled by a quiet rancher, a Chinese woman, and an old preacher. He shot Jacob a look of pure hatred. "This ain't over," he snarled, before turning on his heel and stalking back to the saloon, his men trailing behind him like defeated dogs. The crowd began to break up, murmuring amongst themselves. Some still looked hostile, but others, moved by Mei Lin's words and the Reverend's stand, looked at the couple with a new, grudging respect. Mrs. Gable huffed in disgust and marched away. Jacob took Mei Lin's hand. It was still cold, but no longer trembling. He led her up the steps and into the cool, quiet sanctuary of the church. The heavy doors closed behind them, shutting out the noise and the hatred of the world, leaving them in a silent, sacred space. They had walked through fire, and they had come out the other side, together. The ceremony was short and simple. The only witnesses were the Reverend and God. Jacob's voice was steady as he spoke the vows he never thought he would speak again. When it was Mei Lin's turn, she repeated the words the Reverend fed her, her accent lending a strange, beautiful music to the ancient promises. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Jacob turned to her. He was supposed to kiss his bride, but the gesture felt too intimate, too presumptuous for the fragile, unclassifiable bond between them. Instead, he gently took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a soft, respectful kiss to her knuckles. A faint blush colored her cheeks, and she gave him that small, rare smile that made his heart ache. The ride back to the ranch was as quiet as the ride into town, but the silence was of a completely different character. It was no longer tense or awkward. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet, the silence of a shared victory, of a storm weathered. The landscape, which had seemed so harsh and menacing that morning, now looked beautiful, bathed in the soft gold of the late afternoon sun. When they arrived back at the cabin, the place felt different. It was no longer his home where she was a guest. It was their home. The word she had used in town echoed in his mind. Jia. That evening, they sat at the table for dinner, the same as any other night, but everything had changed. He was no longer just her protector. He was her husband. She was no longer a stranger under his roof. She was his wife. The titles felt immense, foreign, and yet, somehow, profoundly right. After the meal, as she was clearing the plates, he reached out and caught her hand. "Mei Lin," he said. She stopped and looked at him, her eyes questioning. He stood up and walked to the small chest in the corner where he kept Martha's things. He had not opened it in 5 years. With a deep breath, he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a simple, silver locket. He took it out. It was plain, unadorned, the kind of thing a practical woman like Martha would have cherished. He walked back to Mei Lin and, with slightly trembling fingers, he fastened it around her neck. The silver gleamed against the dark fabric of her dress. It was a piece of his past, a symbol of a love he had lost. But giving it to her felt like an act not of replacement, but of continuation. It was an acknowledgement that his heart, which he had thought dead and buried, was capable of feeling again. She lifted the locket, her fingers tracing its smooth surface. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with an emotion so deep and clear it took his breath away. There was gratitude, yes, but there was also something more, a dawning affection, a profound and tender connection that transcended words. He reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. The guarded woman who had stepped off the train, the frightened refugee who had hidden behind a wall of silence, was gone. In her place was this strong, beautiful, resilient woman, his wife. He leaned down and gently, hesitantly, pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of promise. It was soft, chaste, and filled with all the unspoken things they had been unable to say. It was a kiss of respect, of partnership, of a shared future forged in adversity. When he pulled back, she was looking at him, her lips slightly parted, her eyes dark and luminous. Later that night, as he lay by the hearth, he listened to the sound of her soft breathing from the other room. The flimsy wooden door that separated them felt like an impassable barrier. He was her husband, yet they were still strangers in the most intimate sense. He had married her to protect her, but he was beginning to realize, with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty, that he wanted more. He wanted a true marriage, a true partnership. He wanted to break down that final wall between them. He rose from his chair and walked to her door, his heart pounding. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if she saw this as just another part of the bargain, another duty she was forced to perform? He couldn't bear the thought of frightening her, of tainting the trust they had so carefully built. As he stood there, torn by indecision, the door opened. She was standing there, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her long, dark hair unbound and cascading over her shoulders. She looked at him, her expression soft and questioning in the moonlight streaming through the window. She had been waiting for him. She said nothing. She simply stepped back, holding the door open, inviting him in. And as he crossed the threshold from his world into hers, he knew that he hadn't just saved a stranger. He hadn't just bought himself a helpmate or found a practical partner. He had found the missing part of his own soul. He had awaited a simple bride, a woman to share his labor and his silence. But the universe, in its infinite and mysterious wisdom, had sent him Mei Lin. It had sent him love. And in the quiet sanctuary of their small cabin, under the vast, star-dusted Montana sky, their two lonely worlds finally, irrevocably, became one. The following morning, Jacob awoke to a world that felt fundamentally new. The light slanting through the single-bedroom window seemed warmer, the air sweeter. He turned his head and saw Mei Lin sleeping beside him, her face peaceful in repose, her dark hair a silken river against the pale pillowcase. A fierce, protective tenderness washed over him, so potent it was almost painful. This was his wife. The reality of it, the simple, profound fact of it, settled into his bones. Their life together found a new rhythm, one marked not by caution and necessity, but by a quiet, burgeoning intimacy. The gestures that had once been their only form of communication now became a language of affection. A touch of her hand on his arm as he left for the fields, the way he would brush a stray strand of hair from her face, a shared smile over a simple meal. These small moments became the bedrock of their marriage. He continued to teach her English, and she, in turn, began to teach him her own language. In the evenings, she would guide his large, clumsy hand as he tried to replicate the elegant characters she painted. He learned the symbol for water, mountain, and horse. One evening, she painted two characters side by side. The first was the symbol for man, the second for tree. Together, she explained, her English growing more confident each day, it means rest. A man leaning against a tree. He looked at the symbol, then at her, and understood. That was what they were to each other. A place of rest in a harsh and wearying world. The town, for its part, remained a place of cautious neutrality. Their marriage had granted them a kind of grudging acceptance. They were an oddity, the Van Cess, but they were no longer a scandal. The Reverend Thayer made a point of greeting them warmly whenever he saw them, his public approval acting as a shield against the worst of the town's gossips. Mrs. Gable still sniffed disapprovingly, but from a distance. Silas Croft was gone, having reportedly transferred to a different railroad spur further west, his humiliation in Redemption Creek too great to bear. One day, a package arrived at the general store for Mrs. May Lynn Vance. It was from Sister Agnes in San Francisco. Inside was a small, leather-bound Bible with both English and Chinese text, and a long letter. May Lynn spent a week poring over it, her dictionary by her side. She says, May Lynn told him one night, her voice thick with emotion, that Sarah Miller spoke of you until the end. She said you sounded like her father, a good man, a farmer. She was happy to know I was coming to a good man. The knowledge that Sarah Miller, a woman he had never met, had played such a pivotal role in their lives, that her final act had been one of such selfless compassion, humbled Jacob. He and May Lynn were the beneficiaries of a dying woman's grace. It made their own bond feel all the more sacred. As the seasons turned, from the golden autumn to the stark, white silence of winter, their partnership deepened. They worked together, preparing for the harsh months ahead, chopping wood, insulating the cabin, salting meat. During a brutal blizzard that trapped them in the cabin for a week, they did not grow restless or weary of each other's company. Instead, the forced confinement became a kind of gift. He told her stories of his childhood, of his parents, of Martha. She told him of her village in China, of the festivals and the food and the family she had lost. They filled the silent, empty spaces of the cabin and of their own hearts with the stories of their lives. He discovered she had a wry sense of humor, a quick wit that her initial struggles with the language had hidden. She would tease him about his terrible singing voice, or the way he grumbled at the old horse, Zeus. He, in turn, would playfully mock her seriousness as she tended her small collection of indoor herbs. Laughter, a sound he had thought long banished from his home, became a regular guest. One crisp spring morning, as the last of the snow was melting and the world was turning green again, May Lynn met him at the door as he came in from the barn. Her face was pale, but her eyes were shining with a bright, nervous light. "Jacob," she said, taking his hands in hers. "I have news." She placed one of his large, calloused hands on her still flat stomach. "We have, Jia," she said, using the word that had come to mean everything to them. "Home. Family." He stared at her, his mind struggling to comprehend. Then, a slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. He swept her up in his arms, lifting her off the floor and spinning her around, his laughter echoing in the small cabin. He was going to be a father again. The life he had thought was over, the family he had thought was lost to him forever, was being reborn. He looked at his wife, her face radiant with happiness, and his heart felt so full it might burst. He hadn't just found a partner or a companion. He had found a love that was fierce and true, a love that had grown like a stubborn wildflower in the most inhospitable of soils. The woman who had stepped off the train a year ago was not the simple bride he had been expecting. She was more. She was everything. She was his soul, his rest, his home. And together, they would build a new life, a new family, on this rugged piece of land that had, against all odds, become their own promised Gamson. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.